I could do slides and stuff, but I figure a lot of my slides would be pretty comparable to things you could already find on YouTube. So instead, I kind of just wanted to just talk with you all today. And I've got my here bullet list of things to kind of chat through. So we'll start with those, and then we'll see what we've got time sort of remaining to sort of answer questions, anything people want to talk about. Pretty open book. One of the upsides of what I do is that I've got a very zigzaggy career, so I'll kind of be talking through some kind of points from. So because of that, I have sort of a sampler platter background, where a lot of what I do when I'm advising people, training people, is they're trying to figure out, are they trying to be on a small company, big company, startup scene, more established space, what are the priorities, timeline, etc. And I can kind of sampler platter, look back on, compare and contrast some differences. I started making games in 1997, and this is as freeware. It was as a hobbyist. This is before the first wave of indie stuff. This is more of just, it just seemed like a fun thing to do. And I very much sort of lucked into that, eventually became a career path from an accidental head start. But I was just a guy who liked video games, found that something I enjoyed doing. And so a bunch of my games I've released over the years, you mentioned over 100, a bunch of them are freeware, hobby stuff on the side, including when I had a AAA job, when I was at a startup, when I was doing R&D for big and small companies. And otherwise, I still just kept producing freeware games on the side, an average of maybe 4 or 5 a year. Oh, there's a classroom. But yeah, so anyway, so the industry side stuff began from, went to Carnegie Mellon for undergrad for computer science. At that time, started the game development club there. That's Game Creation Society. That's still operating now many years later. I've obviously been totally hands off from it since graduation in 2007. I guess 10 years after I started making games. From there, I went off to Electronic Arts. I was in and out of there for a few years on Boom Blocks for Wii and Medal of Honor Airborne for Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, which increasingly I realize are dated entries in games and maybe like the same age as some of you potentially. So I get that. Went from there off to a friend's startup. That became Zip Zap Play, or that was the main service they were known for. It was an online tool. Kids could build their own games and stuff online, share those. I think we had 100,000 games on that platform. And then just the nature of Silicon Valley and investor pressures, they had to pivot in a different direction than what I got there to do. So I left that company, went on to do other things. Made an iPhone game that did very well for a publisher. Less well for me. I mean, it helped my positioning, but financially, most of that revenue went to the publisher. It's the nature of kind of doing business in your early 20s with no lawyer, with no capital behind you, with no formal studio around you. But, kind of survived those, recovered from it. From there, went off into graduate school, made some, did some work for Will Wright over a summer at Stupid Fun Club. I can't talk a whole lot about that. That's one of the most NDA'd things I've worked on. Everything else I've worked on for the most part. What's nice is that because I have no intentions of going back to big studios or back to even Silicon Valley, and also because now so much time has passed, I can kind of speak, like I say, pretty transparently about that stuff to a degree of comfort that some people don't have because they're worried it's going to affect their ability to get their next gig or burn a bridge or something. I'm not worried about that. Ever since that time, I've been teaching online. That's been doing the past 8 years or so. I've got video courses, YouTube videos, podcast episodes, been going same 7-8 years. Mostly I got a big training group, people around the world who are making games for practice. And longer term schedules and jams when they need help. Me and my trainers help troubleshoot them through production planning and coding issues and level design and game art and so on. We've made 160 games that way alone in the past 7 years. And that's sort of become sort of at the core and heart of the work that I do today, which is actually sort of like a college club in that it's, or a high school club, I suppose, in that it's modeled after the one I started at Carnegie Mellon and then at Georgia Tech when I was in grad school, started another one over there. And so that was kind of the main beats throughout the journey, any one of which, again, I'm happy to kind of go back and zero in on and tell stories from, answer questions about, whatever you might like. But essentially, it's been at any given time a super wonderful part of my life. I really enjoy making games. This is one of these things that keeps me teaching, is that it's been so beneficial for me. It's helped me meet new people, given me excuse. I've been involved with IndieCade now for 7-8 years. Used to be a speaker organizer for 85 of those talks people gave. Helped start IndieCade Europe, so it gave me a reason to fly to France. I had never left this continent, really. And then I got to go to Europe because of game development. Been to GDC a bunch of times, met a lot of people I would not have met otherwise. And one of the things I also really like about game development as a general field is how much it's a chance to really get in there and work with people who have different backgrounds than us, different strengths than us, different interests than us, in a way of a lot of other fields. And it's not to diminish them, it's just as a, different strokes, different folks kind of thing. But my friends who may say went off into aeronautics engineering, maybe they kind of wind up in a whole huge department and only ever really talk to other aeronautic engineers. People who go into medicine or all kinds of other, again, important, great fields don't necessarily have the same opportunities we do in game design or game development of every single day working with artists, working with musicians, working with programmers, working with producers, working with just people have a totally different lens on priorities, issues, backgrounds, priorities. That's the thing I really like about it, is people it brings into our lives, and how much more I think we get to know each other when we build things together, when we're making projects, troubleshooting problems together, each bringing a different set of our tools and strengths and interests. There have been, over those years, a number of little bumps, and this is where anybody who's been in games will certainly confess those, about challenges of big studio issues, small company issues. But I think in many cases it's been a mixture of either. To me, that was my guidepost of that was not necessarily the right place I wanted to stay long term. And it doesn't mean I regretted the time that I spent there. It meant I tried on the shoe. I'm grateful for the privilege of being able to have it in my background, to know what I'm not missing. But, on the other hand, there are people who kind of find any given one of those contexts are the place for them. They spend the next 20, 30 years happily, similarly happily, with some ups and downs, in big companies, small companies, university, you name it. It is one of these kind of fields, again, that's got so many different directions it can go in, that it's a nice foundation to build off of, in addition to the kind of hobby side of, no matter what, you can just keep making games on the side, just like we tell stories, dance, paint. Those are kind of one of the lenses I try to bring to it. The future of game stuff, obviously what we've been seeing so far, even just since I started my career, has been a major dovetailing. And I think that sometimes people make the mistake of looking at the future of games things as if it's one or the other. Like, which one of these is going away? How is it going to be different? And some of that's going to happen. I mean, I've got an old pinball table behind me, got an old arcade cabinet behind me. I have friends who worked on commercial pinball and commercial arcade cabinets. Obviously, they're now doing other things. So there are parts that go down, but for the most part, it dovetails, right? So it's not that like casual games went away. It's that they're still there, but also there's this other stuff. It's not that single player went away. It's that now there's also this other stuff. And I think that's a helpful lens too, because some of the time when from our, even just player perspective, when we're younger, getting started out, there's a frustration some players express. I think one of our first speakers we had in a college club was a guy who worked on porting Madden. And some of the students seemed kind of annoyed because they're kind of like me, grew up playing Ninja Gaiden and Mega Man and Mario and what have you. And they just kind of felt annoyed at, well, is there something... How do you feel about making sports games, about making Madden stuff? Are you taking away from this other stuff? And I think the guy had a really sound point that no, all those things still exist. And they're still working great for the same people they always did. This has nothing to do with that. Instead, this is the reason why your sibling, who may have had no interest in the things that you like, bothered to buy a PlayStation, has an Xbox in their house or whatever, because they have one or two games that they really like. And then maybe while they already have that hardware anyway, they're also going to explore some of the things you've enjoyed. And it's another way we can connect with each other. It was something that going from, I grew up in small town Midwest, didn't have a lot of other technical people around me, at least the time period, the small city I grew up in. But it was something I really enjoyed that culturally, when I went off to college and we had a bunch of other international students, people from different parts of the world and country and so on, we could all connect on. We'd all sort of known a lot of the same references through our media and entertainment enjoyment. Games, obviously, no less than films, books, anything else. In a way, we kind of, our playground was all Hyrule. Our playground was all GoldenEye in my generation, that kind of thing. In terms of sectors for game development or game design as a field, my formal hats I've traditionally worn was as a technical game designer, electronic arts, which essentially is the overlap or the Venn diagram between a programmer and a game designer, a bit like a tech artist. It's someone who has maybe good skills at both instead of excellent skills in one and low in the other. And so examples of the kind of work that I would do in that was I would help build the weapon upgrade system, but also author some of the elements for it. I would help by building a bunch of level design stuff for boom blocks. I also built my own level editor tool for it, so that whenever I had ideas for, it'd be cool if I could do this when I'm shaping these spaces, it would help me work faster, streamline my workflow, I could then dig directly into that tool and then make those kind of changes. As a side effect of that, I do lean towards, I'm a rapid prototyper at heart. Even in the giant companies like Google outside of games, there's sort of different hats engineers wind up wearing. There's sort of product development side, and there's sort of a little more build for scale engineering end. In between those two, essentially one can do things a little more hacky because the point isn't to make it scalable, robust, secure, well architected. It's just make it exist so someone can try it and see, is this fun? Is this worth keeping? And then it becomes some other engineer's work who's got a different kind of set of gears in there that they like to work with. And their exercise becomes, how do I optimize this? How to make this more performant? How to make this scale better? How to make this integrate better to our existing systems? Between that slider, I tend to fall more on the rapid prototyping, the game development functions side. But like I said, technical game designer. So essentially, I'm a game designer who uses programming as a means to my end of not having to be at the mercy of someone else's interpretation when I have ideas for, hey, this would be interesting, or wouldn't it be cool if I'm never having to tug on someone else's shirt and try to explain it. And then, well, that's not quite what I meant. Could you do a little more like this? I get that much tighter loop if I can go in there and make my changes. Let's see. I've also interviewed a bunch of other game developers, and so this is something where between my podcast, I used to, like I say, organize Indicate speakers. IGDA, I was the LA chair for a year or two. Organized a bunch of panels and stuff for that. So because of that, I've also kind of keep dibs in other fields, other areas of industry, and can sometimes share stories secondarily or point it towards people for that kind of question. Here's someone who has great material, great information. So for example, I'm not an audio guy, but I know people who teach good audio stuff if people here have questions about that hat. A normal project or day, which I'm just kind of skimming here my bullet list of things to chat about, varies a lot one job to the other. And so I guess I can kind of at least address those at the high level. In the big companies, the typical day looked not unlike what you might also have in any non-game big company, right? Big companies are big companies. Human politics are what they are. And so like another company with engineers and designers, morning stand-ups, getting people to figure out what are your blockers, who needs to be having meetings today. We'd go off to our desks, work on our respective tasks, maybe coordinate with whoever else we've been in touch with. Sometime late in day, go through product review with some producers to figure out, does this need a course correct? Does this need extra support? Should we cut this where it's at and move on to something else? And then sort of within that sort of micro daily schedule, a macro schedule of your routine events, your Tokyo Game Show, your GDC, E3, whatever the kind of events like this that people have special preparations for, where there's a demo to get out by then. And so by the time the game is released, it's gone through 4, 5, 6, 8, 12, depending iterations of we need showable stuff. And what are the trade-offs and priorities we do for that? What corners are we accepting to cut for that to make it work? And then kind of revisiting that. So that's the big company pattern. In the smaller company, it was a much different experience. And instead of being in that stand-up of a room full of designers and mostly communicating through my lead designer, like I say, I'm mostly from smaller team background. In the startup, there were literally 4, 5, 6 of us in a guy's house. And we were working out of a room in their house in Silicon Valley, where I knew exactly what Jess did and John did and David did and Mathilde did. And there was a lot of overlap. It wasn't quite as clear cut as you're only here to do this. That was one of the things that I personally found a mismatch between my deep needs and how big companies work. At EA, if I wanted to go do some other engineering stuff in the rendering pipeline, if I wanted to make some sort of sound effects, obviously not. No way, don't do that, right? Hyper specialized in the big company. You're there to do one thing and be really good at it. And it's total opposite in the small company environment of constantly having to change hat. Sometimes I was a producer, sometimes I was a community manager, sometimes I was doing some art, sometimes I was designing example games. Whatever we needed doing, we just had a set of people with a set of skills and some overlap of who's got cycles. Okay, well, Dave could do this, but he's needed on back end right now. And that's sort of a much more dynamic feel of small teams I like. I find it exciting. It drives some people nuts, right? And especially if you have a deep interest in wanting to be a world expert in animation, in AI, in network code, whatever. That tends to happen to those big companies where someone can go there day to day and only do that thing. And so I've got friends who at EA, they only worked on network backend code for like 8, 10 years. Never touched gameplay stuff, never touched rendering, never touched anything the player sees, but just keep the servers running. There's animators over there who their specialization is like hands, first-person camera hands. And if someone else wants to do hands, don't do it. Paul's doing that. And if Paul wants to do something else, sorry, we actually need you on hands because that's kind of what you're really good at. And so again, if you want to be the best in the world at that, great. A friend who works on a Marvel game kind of joked about first part of his career was being the rock expert on the team. If he can make low poly, good detail, efficient, reuse of materials, textures, rocks. He'd go home and study rocks, look at photos of rocks. That is that big company making Marvel kind of games experience that results in some really good looking rocks, really polished experience. But in contrast to, as I went even further in the small company direction, made some indie games after that startup time, 5, 7 million people heard me go like, with my mouth when the blocks popped together in a little iPhone game because I was our sound person, I was our level designer, I was our main engineer, I was our UI person. Kind of had to, but got to do everything. And that was, again, where I also sort of got some bruises, just as, again, everyone in the career Zigzag of Games tends to do, about figuring out the challenges of also trying to wear the business hat, which is a thing that I've increasingly gotten more proficient at. A lot of what I do anymore is kind of help people who maybe have more of an engineering mindset also kind of overcome some of the production strategies, some of the basics, very fundamentals of just kind of operating a little more business lens to what they're doing. But it's different than I have an idea for a game, I want to make it. When there are contracts, when there's bigger agencies involved with more money sloshing around, there's some stress that goes with that. Let's see, in terms of, but anymore now that I'm a teacher, it again kind of varies wildly. A lot of what I do is I've got on my schedule a bunch of blocks that my students, who again are people around the world in 19 time zones, they can schedule time for me with help when they have. So I've got maybe 12 projects I'm overseeing right now between my 3 different communities. And so somebody hits a problem. They were trying to overcome an issue in Unity. They were trying to do a thing in Blender. They're trying to figure out maybe a human issue of, hey, this person on the team's doing work I can't really use. I don't want to be mean to them, but like logistically it's bad for the team. What do I do? So they schedule a time with me. That shows up on my calendar. I do a Zoom call. We talk them through that. Within an hour, the problem solved. That's a bunch of what my day-to-day work entails. Aside from that, I'm also producing at a given time content on a pretty consistent basis. I mostly have the privilege of not ever needing to pay for ads. Everything that I do is my own vertical. So I've got my own podcast, my own YouTube video channel with some viral videos. The podcast's got 130,000 downloads. The video course is 350,000 students. This is my own content, self-published. And then those things wind up, each one kind of has a little bit of a promo about, oh, by the way, if you like this, check out my other stuff. And that's sort of been like I say, an angle to it, which is different than just the game making. But it's where the flexibility of my schedule. If I have a day where there's not a lot of calls scheduled, then my energy is going into content creation to make sure that I keep fresh messaging, continued kind of involvement with people who, when they look me up because they're thinking about joining my group, they're trying to figure out, is this a real person? Does he seem trustworthy? Is his head on straight? That kind of thing. But, like I say, I'm very much, I identify mainly as a teacher now, even though I still lead some projects, leading one right now. The kind of projects I'm leading are frankly designed for practice for my students as another option to latch into and try making a model, try making some sound effects, try making some pieces work together. Then we've got... so actually, I want to open it for questions before, because otherwise we're kind of near most of my bullets. But are there any questions or things people would like me to go back to, speak more concretely to? I can also kind of ramble indefinitely, as, again, I do audiobooks and podcasting, so I'll talk by that end. For student privacy, I didn't record any of the student voices, and so I'll be paraphrasing here the questions that they asked. The first one is, how do you go about learning all the variety of skills involved in making games? Yeah, so a few different options. I guess a couple points to that. And again, this is specifically what I actually work with a lot of adults with, who they maybe have not as much time in their schedule, but some other advantages. And the 2 things that I kind of tend to focus on are, one, starting with very, very, very tiny games. So even if the ultimate goal, I think, often should be teamwork, team projects, doing things with bigger teams, when you start with some really, really small stuff you can do mostly solo, and purely for practice, not because it's going to be great, not because it's going to be ambitious, but mostly solo, it kind of forces you to learn to fill in your own gaps. If you do an old Breakout, an old Pong, an old racing game or whatever, like, again, it may not be exciting, but in the process, you're getting, I've made a sound, I've worked with something like Photoshop, Photopia, I like better, by the way. I've made a 3D model if you're in Unity or Unreal, Godot, some other pipeline. And so in those kind of cases, the small projects just give you enough familiarity that helps you coordinate with others. And I think that's a useful lens to have with it, where you're not trying to become an expert in art or sound or whatever. You're just trying to appreciate enough the difficulties of it. You're trying to be unblocked by the pipeline. And what I mean by that is, if you have an idea you want to express to the team, you don't want to be at the mercy of, until the sound person has availability, you can't show your idea to people. You want to be able to, I'm comfortable. I can use Audacity. I can make something. It won't be great. We may not ship it, but I can make it work well enough. And again, the same thing also applies to code of, you may not be trying to write console-ready performant stuff with custom memory management, whatever, but can you make it work somehow in a way that someone else can play it and be like, wow, this is great, or have you considered changes like this? And you can have a concrete thing to discuss, takes you much further than just kind of ideas and whiteboards. There's designers who that is their day-to-day. It's rare. Those are very few positions and they're hotly contested. But so basically it's small projects first. The other part is to basically rotate where your laser lens of focus is. So you're going to probably more likely, I think, and for people that I work with, have better results in the long run, whether you divide it up by month, by quarter, by day of the week, by something. A time when, okay, well, for the next few months, I'm really going to try to become an audio person. I'm really going to try to put on the artist hat. My full focus for a little while is going to be that. And I might still do other things, but in support of that. What can I do from code or from sound or something to make me a better artist, or a better audio person, or whatever, better composer, than if you try to do them all in parallel all the time, you make such slow progress on all that you don't really see those gains, right? Does that make sense? So like instead of a little bit of sound, a little bit of art, you got to start that way to say have a minimum functional fluency, but they're after myself and my friends who have sort of multiple class skill sets. It's because for a while I was a producer, for a while I was an engineer, for a while I was a designer, rather than trying to all the time be all of them at once. The other reason for this is that when we don't have that focus that we've decided for this year, for this month, for this quarter, whatever time chunk you decide to rotate that laser focus in, it avoids this otherwise tendency to dodge what would be difficult for us because we're new to it, to instead do what we're already comfortable at. And this is a very human, natural thing to do. But if let's say I'm very comfortable in programming, and I'm trying to, there's some sound needed and some art needed, whatever, I'm going to keep distracting myself by going back and writing code because I'm comfortable with it, because I'm fast at it, it feels good, I don't have that frustration, I don't have that slowdown, I have to go look things up. And that same thing, no matter what your strength is, can really keep your other weaknesses weak. Again, if you don't actively say, okay, well, my purpose for this times period is I want to get better at modeling. And I know that in the process, other parts are going to not be getting as much attention. That's the only way to move that marker forward on the board and then cycle focus something else. I also encourage this because it's a big part of figuring out what we like. Even within design, within production, within, for that matter, programming or some other field, there's a lot of subfield overlap. So as much as I was a technical game designer, there's technical artists. As much as there are game designers, there's technical game designers, there's different types of game designers, level designers, narrative designers is sort of in that constellation, not quite the same thing. But it really, you don't know till you've tried it. You can read about other people's stories, you can hear about them on podcasts, you can like or dislike those parts of the game, but doing it is what informs it. And so I think it's helpful to kind of, like say, sampler platter, try out different versions of it. And then the other part is even the ones you leave behind, A, you know what you're not missing. B, you can better coordinate with those people. And then C, it kind of gives you some additional tools in your tool set or lenses you can take to other problems where, okay, I'm trying to do this thing in a game for a puzzle. The idea isn't coming across. Well, I've had some little bit of narrative design experience. Can we change the narrative framing in a way that helps the player understand what they're supposed to do? And it just equips us with more tools that we can use to solve problems. And a lot of what we're doing as game designers is solving kind of bizarre one-off problems that don't have a clear analog to other things. And so the more tools you've got in your tool set, the better you're going to do. Do you recommend Unity or Unreal? I'm going to give a it depends answer, which I know can be annoying, but I think it's important. I've used Unreal professionally. It's what Medal of Honor Airborne was built in. Now, granted, it was Unreal Engine 3, so obviously we're now 2 versions behind if we're counting that UE5 is technically deployed. I've mostly used Unity. So out of the 160 games made at a home team in the past 7 years, Unity was probably half-ish of those. The other half of those was JavaScript on browser canvas, not another engine. But the reason for that is less to do because one or the other is better and more to do with their use cases, which is a better fit. So I liken this a bit to construction equipment, right? Like a bulldozer, like a crane. It is superior equipment for the jobs it is built to do. But I do not have the crew to manage it effectively, and I'm probably going to destroy something if I try to use it. As opposed to if what I need is a hole in my yard, a shovel, despite being let's be clear, inferior tool, is a better fit for my scale. And so Unity is much more of our shovel in this case. For small teams, for solo people, Unity is a much easier environment where, like I described in the small company, we're all wearing multiple hats. I'm doing code, I'm doing design, I'm doing level design, I'm dropping in some art and sound assets and whatever. Unity makes that a little bit more natural flow. Unreal, it has plenty of strengths, but it's really, really built in mind with you've got a big studio of full-time veteran developers who are hyper-specialized, that you have someone who's only focused on physics model rigs, someone who's only focused on materials and shaders, someone who's deeply focused in optimizing code. And so the other thing that happens, for example, with Unreal is that a small team will try to replicate their workflow from what they used to do in Unity, where, okay, well, they can use blueprints and kind of like smack together some components and get some basic functionality working. And this is, again, where like as a rapid prototyper, as a technical game designer, this is a decent way to express the idea. But if their intention is to ship it and have it be performant and it's on the tick, meaning happening every frame, then in practice, typically they're taking that back into C++, and suddenly you hit a much higher wall of complexity, which is worth doing if you have the engineering team size, time to sort all that stuff out. But for smaller teams, often winds up chewing a ton of time and energy on problems that are frankly invisible to the player for the complexity of the game that they were producing. And so it winds up being where you're going to say, generally speaking, Unity is a better fit for your small teams. Unreal is a better fit for your enormous, big, full-time teams. There's obviously a gray area in the middle, and that also depends a bit on genre. So this is also a case where in any tool, if you want to make an RPG that looks like it's from the 90s, RPG Maker, like that's the answer, right? If you want to make a text-based kind of visual novel, well, RenPy is perfect for that. There's certain genres that one of the others are better fit for. And so like another case of the Unreal Unity distinction, Unreal, while being a general game engine, was very tightly built around these use cases of Gears of War and the old Unreal titles. And because of that, it has certain assumptions about how movement works, about how cameras are supposed to operate, about scales and distance and LODs and so on, deeply rooted in there. That if those are a complementary fit to the kind of game your team is working on, you've got a huge head start and it's going to work and look great. And if it's not, you're going to have a lot of trouble trying to untangle and wrestle that to be something it's not, because it's not really built to be an RTS engine. On the other side, Unity is much more general. It arguably had a test case, frankly, that derailed so early on that it just became a much more general thing, but you are sort of in equal striking distance to a flight simulator, a board game, some other RTS, FPS, whatever, space simulator in Unity as any other genre, because it's as style agnostic as it is. That said, the other kind of trade-off to either of those as well is that they both build on an assumption you have a better sense for what time and energy they're saving you. And let me kind of untangle that a bit, because I know it's a weird thread that a lot of my work focuses on. But it's a bit like in high school, right? Before you're using graphing calculators, you're using non-graphing calculators. Before using non-graphing calculators, you're doing stuff by hand on paper. Log division, multiplication, addition, carrying digits, all that stuff. And it's not because that's a better way to do it. It's not because calculators are wrong or bad. It's because if you can't do it by hand, you're missing some pretty deep things and taking them for granted when you jump into calculators. Same thing if you can't graph it by hand. By the time you get to a graphic calculator, you've got some deficiencies in your deeper understanding of how and why what's happening is happening. So the same thing happens for these engines, where really the people that they're built for are primarily people who before that were building games in SFML, SDL, C++, DirectX, whatever, XNA. And then on top of that, oh great, I can save all myself this time with dropping in rigid bodies and rendering cameras and whatever. And there's some layers in the middle about how movement works, about how coordinate systems work, about how constraints and boundaries and collisions are detected, that if you have built some games without either engine, without any engine, and you can still build on like a vaguely modern layer of libraries, so you're not having to write your own pixel plotters and image importing code. This is why we use JavaScript and browser canvas for this in our groups. Then you kind of learn a lot better fundamentals about how movement works in gameplay logic, about how collision's being handled, about how input's being done. And these little things we take for granted that are nuances about how time passes, about how movement happens, about how collisions are determined, that if you know those things from working without Unreal or Unity, when you go into Unreal or Unity, you can get more horsepower, better results out of them, because you've got these additional tool sets there's other ways to solve that problem. A character sometimes gets out of bounds, but I know that because of certain things about we're playing a sports game, those bounds are permanent. They're always in the same place, etc. There's simple, more powerful ways to fix it in the code than anything you're going to accomplish with the physics engine in Unity or Unreal, where they're just built to behave in certain ways that are good general cases if you need blocks that are fumbling all over each other, and less good for the tight, responsive gameplay of characters that move the way they do in platformers, of cars that drive unrealistically but in a satisfying way that meets player expectation based on old kind of arcade conventions. And so again, it's the other thing is that in many of our cases, we find it's helpful to help train people without an engine before they go to the engine, or if they're already comfortable in the engine, even then in many cases, taking what we might consider a step back, making some simpler games without it, to kind of brush up on some fundamentals, fill in some gaps, and then we go back to it. Again, it's just like if you took Algebra 2 without having done those things by hand because you have a graphing calculator, if you went back and brushed up on doing it without it, you can kind of get a better sense of how to build on that and do more with it when you get there.
What did you study in college?
Yeah, okay, great. So undergrad was computer science, although I will caveat that with at the time, I had never taken any computer science. My high school had none of it. I didn't have any programming classes. We had keyboard typing is what we had. So I went in there and had no idea what I was getting into. It was a lot of proofs. It was a lot of math. It's actually much more of a math degree than a programming degree. And so I ran into some complications of I am deeply a very experienced programmer since I was a preteen, but I was less good at my high school skipped geometry proofs. And it turns out proofs are a big part of computer science math. And so, that was helpful. I will say what that helped do too was open up the doors for legitimizing. Bigger companies like to see that kind of credential. They like to see that sort of foundation. It's also a strong one for backup plans. And this is something you're going to find for a lot of people in games. And I've heard the same from everybody who goes to my podcast or whatever, is games are a constantly changing field. There's a lot of chaos. Companies close down that did good stuff, that critics liked, that had good teams, that did all the right things. They just vanish because that platform's gone. Times are changing. People got to relocate constantly. And so it is often good to have a degree that also works outside of industry. And so this is often considered the advantage of something that might be more games specific. While those are valid and nothing wrong with them necessarily, it is harder to go from a games specific degree to a non-games job. Then I have a background in comp sci, so I have been hit up by Google or other companies like that to get jobs there that I ultimately didn't need to take. But knowing that that was like in the back pocket of an option was very beneficial to having the security to take chances in small business and otherwise I might not have had the privilege to do. I minored in business. That was incredibly helpful. And that was actually partly the advice of Jesse Schell, one of the founders of the ETC at Carnegie Mellon. This is a grad school, so I didn't do that. I was an undergrad there. But basically, he found that a lot of people were complementing or double majoring comp sci with business, which was really kind of ahead of its time because this was in 2004 to 2007, or I guess 2003 to 2007. So it was still kind of pre-early, the renaissance of indie boom of X&A and Congregate and Newgrounds, that kind of era. But essentially, as an indie person, the need to wear my own business hat and deal with basic business questions could not possibly overstate how helpful that's been to me. And the other weird thing about a business degree or a business minor even, there's a ton of stuff that frankly are life skills for any career that is sort of upsetting that only get covered in business classes. I'm talking how to do well in interviews. You're going to need that regardless. How to give presentations. Going to need that regardless. How to communicate well written. Also going to need regardless. And like these are just very deeply fundamental skills that if you, or heck, basic accounting. Again, like even if you're not running a business, if you have a budget because you have an income, it helps to know some pretty basic accounting so you're not just confused and blown away and hoping an accountant keeps things straight for you, which you should do that too. But like business, very valuable. As a minor, as a double major, as a primary major, very valuable field to get an education in. Take any classes you can get, take them online if you have to, whatever. Business is valuable. Grad school, I actually went back to humanities side for that. I was in digital media at Georgia Tech. And one of the bizarre things about games in academia. So academia doesn't like the idea that anything is new. And this is partly because the nature of how academics approach things is to build on the history, the lineage, the culture, all this kind of stuff, right? And so because of that, it wasn't like, oh, games started in the 80s or even the 60s, depending on what we count. Instead, you get these different lenses. On one school thinks about games as starting with storytelling traditions and like Shakespeare and like the history of plot and character and now a new development's interaction in that space. So they might like form it off of the drama school. It's part of what ETC did. It took some of the drama school, put it over there. Some take a much more computational approach. So USC, or not USC, that's more actually a film school. So again, same thing. USC took it off the film traditions primarily. UC Santa Cruz took it more off the comp sci direction of, well, really they're digital artifacts. They're computational. So their comp sci department built their games program on areas of procedural generated narrative stuff and dynamic systems and games that are built by diagrams and a very computational approach to it. Georgia Tech's approach was actually more off of the literature department and the communication and culture department, or LCC is what it was called at the time. And so because of that, the area of school that I was in was actually more focused on cultural implications, on art and philosophy, on, in some cases, weird overlaps of civics and people's engagement in their communities and ways that, for example, when I started a PhD, I didn't finish the PhD, but after I got my master's, stayed a couple more years for PhD, and I had an entire class where we're studying like athleticism as an angle into understanding game design, reading a bunch of old books about Olympians, about history and sports and commentators in ways that frankly were actually more useful than that sounds, because this was early esports and it was kind of helping us understand what was being developed there of the way consumers engage with it, the way it relates to people's experience of the medium. It's sort of mind-boggling to us starting to have peers who are teachers who would hear from the younger students, do you watch horror games? Do you watch these different, MOBAs? Not do you play, but like that was a new question that we hadn't been asked before. And again, kind of this interesting way these grad schools can be an early vantage point to what's coming around the corner, but it makes a big difference as to what that school's background is. So mine was in digital humanities. Because of that, it's actually why I have the old 1930s pinball machine behind me. My research was actually heavily focused in pinball, and this is partly because out of the different lenses that game historians mostly focused on games and in academia, a lot of them took either a board game approach, and so, dice, cards, tabletop, making decisions, maybe a bit of Dungeons and Dragons, but really these kind of games of decision and chance, usually multiplayer. Games of sports was kind of another lens some academics took, and otherwise storytelling, like I mentioned, plots, character development, world building, that kind of lens. But the kind of games that I liked and grew up with were the arcade stuff, my Donkey Kong, my Mario Brothers, my early console games with a lot of same conventions, Sonic and otherwise, where if we're being really blunt, like the story was bad, the decision making was kind of, don't get hit by the aliens kind of level of decision making. And it was a lot of reflex and timing and high scores and whatever. And really those traditions built off of pinball in terms of getting your extra ball, in terms of playing well to keep playing, in terms of the way that the players taught these metaphors to what to achieve based on, okay, well now I gotta do this and I know what to do that next because of the visual language of what I already come in here knowing about Pirates of the Caribbean or running from the police in Hot Pursuit or something. And so for me, pinball was my area of research, which I enjoyed a lot. But is not really a major part of the work that I do these days. But if people have pinball questions, I can also tell you probably more than you care to hear about pinball.
Which other skills relate most to game design?
At the very least for me, and again, like I say, I was a technical game designer, so my strengths are very much in programming as a means of expressing my ideas. And so for me, it's been pretty heavily skewed towards that. I'm functionally fluent in sound, if I can use sort of the language term, right? So, in people's resumes, they'll say fluent in English, fluent in French, functionally fluent in German or Russian or something. What they mean is I can find my way around, but I'm not going to say anything very clever or poetic, or I might get confused easily. That's my level of understanding of audio. I've composed music. It's not good and you shouldn't listen to it. I can make sound effects that kind of match what the thing is, so you're not distracted by that's way off what just happened. And so, for example, the lens I often encourage when I'm training people who are game designers and what level of art to focus on, it's a similar lens. It's basically, can you tell what it is? And if so, call it done and move on to the next thing. Can I tell that that's a helicopter? Can I tell that that's a chair? Can I tell that that's supposed to be a lantern? Good. Call it done. Rather than going down the rabbit hole of should it be more aesthetic? What are the style? What are the character? Those are important lenses to have. But for someone who's like the artist, who they go out of their way to study composition and color theory and all these different things about aesthetics and anatomy and all that kind of stuff, for my lens as a game designer, my interest in most of these adjacent fields is really, what do I need to do to be able to fill it out so that people can navigate this space accurately, understanding this is what is this over here? Oh, I bet I can interact with that. That looks like a switch. I bet I can use that looks like I can tell that's a door from over here. And the word for that in design is affordance. And it's the same clue commonly used. I think it's an old Norman book about like handles on doors that are either pull because they're a handle or push because it's a plate. And it's, can I tell from a distance what to do with it? That's a really important thing for game designers to be considering. How do players know what to avoid? How do they know where to go? How do they have the impression I'm supposed to collect those? I didn't know I could interact with that. Those are problems that fall on the shoulders of designers. And so again, that's my lens on at least art. Similar to audio, I need to be able to tell meaningfully and functionally, did an important event happen? And so there's a distinction to be made in these games as there is art that is decorative, right? That's props, is tables and vases and lights and lanterns, whatever. There's art, or there's audio that's decorative. It's, you can hear the locusts outside, and there's like a humming of the fluorescent lights and helps establish time and period and level of danger, whatever. As a designer, my interest in these things is very functional. Is an event happening that the player needs to know about? Am I out of ammunition? Did I just get a pickup? Did a door open somewhere? Did the AI see me? And this is an important lens because this is also a different lens than the audio professional or the art professional is going to have. Because every time a bad guy sees you in a whole bunch of FPS games, they grunt or say something. And again, that's not how sound works. That's not how enemies behave, but for design reasons, it's great. And this also includes, so, for example, a lot of game AI, it can sound like an engineering problem, but it really isn't, because typically game AI is not supposed to be the best at it, or we just get destroyed. It's instantaneous at finding the angle it wants. It can calculate perfect leading trajectories. It's just not fun if it's super effective. We're trying to it's a dramatics challenge of theatrically selling its thinking. It knows, but now it's confused and it lost me. And again, this is a sign from the game designer of having your characters shout, "Oh, I lost her. Is she under the table? Oh, I guess she's clear. I'm going to leave the room, giving up the search," or whatever. And nobody talks like that. It's not effective design for the squad to be behaving that way. But for a designer, that's what communicates to the player the state of the AI, so that they have an idea how to play this game mechanically, to know that how long do I have to hide? Am I safe to come out? Have I been seen? And it's like the popular old, built into the human consciousness now, that sound from Metal Gear Solid when they see you and they have a big alert. That's a designer saying, we need a sound for that. And here's kind of the sound that's going to grab your attention, is different than the audio person necessarily, who, again, brains don't make that sound when we see people. So as far as my actual work, it's often programming, if only because that is mechanically the foundation of a lot of the design I do. So Steve Swink has this old book called Game Feel. It's a very good book, but unfortunately expensive and maybe out of print. Game Feel by Steve Swink, Gamefeel. I will also say there's a PDF of it online, not very hard to find. Just putting it out there because, again, it's expensive and out of print, so I don't think he even sees the money for it anymore anyway. But it really focuses on game design at this moment-to-moment, millisecond-to-millisecond degree of perception, motor reflex, envelope feedback curves of when you're holding down the jump button in Mario and you let go, how does that curve fall? And a lot of the kind of things that my interest in game design goes to are those types of details that are very nuanced, very fast, very fine in terms of time, in terms of space relationships, that I couldn't easily experiment with in the same kind of way as certain types of games of decision. This is, again, like games of the board game tradition, games that are a little more kind of military strategy on a hex grid. You can prototype those with cardboard. You can prototype those with dice. You can kind of talk it through. You can make a spreadsheet about it. The kind of game design stuff I tend to focus on as a technical game designer are jumping and movement, and does it feel floaty? Does it feel responsive? Does it feel tight? Does it feel satisfactory? And those kind of things, for me, it helps to tighten that loop if I can be the one in the code, not just tweaking numbers for should this number be bigger or smaller, but fundamentally, is this the right math equation for how this thing should slow down? Is it doing it by percentage? It should do it by linear speed. It should be behaving in a different way in sort of the temporal, So as an example of this, Unity by default tries to treat your keys and your arrows as if they're a joystick. And so it's got some natural fading curves in there. So if you press up or press an arrow and let go, it smoothly brings it up and smoothly brings it down. That may not match the kind of game you're developing. And if you don't know that and how and where to intercept that, and instead be like, no, I want to have absolute discrete movement like an old arcade or old NES game. So I'm motionless, then I'm full speed, and then I stop. You get a very different feel from your character. You get a different sense of heft, different sense of mass, different sense of player control in the environment. Get a more slippery character, which may be desirable for like Mario. A lot of what he did was a lot of slipping and sliding in the old ones. But those are all design questions. As to whether or not it should do that is up to the designer. And so this is also why it's a helpful lens for when you have an idea into what's going on under the hood, how these things work. If, as the designer, you're not paying attention to those details, you can kind of wind up with these very vague, big strokes of, well, this character should be able to double jump. And granted, you can have, the engineer should have latitude to on what that means, but if there's a thing you're trying to achieve, it was kind of an example I came up with my second big AAA job early career. So we had a design spec for a silencer in a FPS game, which lots of FPS games have silencers. You might think, okay, well, it sounds like pew, which, they don't really sound like, but that's movies tell us what they sound like. And then it probably does less damage or is less accurate or whatever. But the other things from the design lens are, okay, well, how far away are we before enemies actually hear this? Do they hear us through doors? Do they have to see the flash? Do we have to be in front of them? If we shoot past them, do they respond to a perceived tracer? All these kind of questions come up that are design questions that if you don't have a lens into why that would matter, how this will affect my scenario design, how this will affect the player experience, the decisions become borderline arbitrary because they just wind up being whatever came naturally at the time of implementation. And so a lot of design work, it comes in the form of, okay, well, yes, we should jump or double jump or have a weapon with a silencer or whatever. But then the second layer of work is, okay, well, is that jump the way we want jump to feel? Is that running the way we want running to happen in this game? Is this item pickup, is that how long the star should last? We just pick the number off the top of our heads initially, and it was 15 seconds. Is that too short? Is that too long? Those are design questions, which again, if you have a bit of programming chops, you can kind of tweak those numbers yourself a little more comfortably or change the operation of how they work. Prototype a feature to put in front of your team. But you don't just want to leave it at the level of, there are, even an example of an old Mario, right? Chris Pratt's Mario, for those who, caught these doing the voice thing, he mentioned playing Mario Brothers in the arcade, and we give him benefit of the doubt, he probably meant Super Mario Brothers Versus, but old Mario Brothers, before Super Mario Brothers, the one mostly that was in the arcade, you didn't actually jump on the bad guys, you hit them from underneath. But in Super Mario Bros., when you do jump on the bad guys, again, there's this question of how on top do you need to be? Do you need to be centered? Can you hit them at an angle? What if you're coming down, but you're kind of to the side of them? And that's going to have a difference in the feel, the difficulty of a game, that if you have a lens into what's going on in the collision implementation, you have much finer tools to play with and feel like this is how I want it, without having to worry about, have I already put in 4 requests for changes and I'm wearing, Jess out and now she kind of hates me and we'll leave it like that. You've just compromised your game because you lack the proficiency to make the change yourself or to experiment until you found something and then said, okay, I like how this is. What do you think? Put the controller in a teammate's hands.
Do you prefer to work alone or with teams?
Big question. Yeah. So I started working alone and I liked a lot of things about it. I liked the control that I had. I liked the pride that I felt like I was doing it all myself. Ultimately, every project I've ever made that's been great work came out of a group of at least 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people. I have some experimental gameplay stuff that's super weird that I'm not ashamed of and only would have happened because it was a personal project, a one-person thing. And so this is a case where if I'm alone, I can make really weird stuff because it doesn't have to speak for anybody else on my team. It could be a personal journey, journal kind of thing. It could be a message about my experience. So you see some indie experimental stuff like this. But as soon as it's got to look better, be more polished, feel better, sound better, no one person is ever going to have all those talents as well as a group of people where they're each filling out for each other. And this includes, even if we've had this happen in our first college club, you put 4 fundamentally programmer people on a team. They're all comp sci majors. Even with them all being of the same training background, taking the same classes together, if out of 4 people, one just says, I'm going to pay attention to making this sound good, and one says, I'm going to pay attention to making this look good, and one says, my focus is going to be on level design and player experience, the other says, I'm going to make sure that this code runs and that it doesn't crash and that it's compatible with other platforms, you're going to have a better project than if it's any one person trying to do that because they are distracting themselves from the ability to focus on, well, hold on, that change is going to impact this. Is that a trade-off we're ready to make here? And so teams are super important. I think a lot of the challenge with teams are actually weirdly egotistical, kind of getting over ourselves, our pride, our sense that we need to be able to do ourselves, our sense we're proving to the whole world that I can do this and I ran a marathon and did this big accomplishment. But most of the games you're enjoying, and there's like a handful of examples through history that are exceptions, are fundamentally team results of a talented composer, talented artists, talented engineers working together, communicating. And so I think it's well worth the skills to practice and develop. How do I coordinate well with others? And that includes, we've also had people who, out of my training, would work with others, then find they actually work better alone, having worked with others, because they can better communicate with others. They can better communicate with their future self. They can document better. They can plan better. They can break things down into better pieces. They can switch hats and say, I'm an artist this week. What are my art tasks that producer me set aside? Comes from team experience fundamentally. So that's my answer to that. It's teams are going to get you a better result. I totally get, especially early on, the desire to do some stuff solo, and it's not bad. It's fine, experimental stuff. You can do some different things that way, but I'm a big advocate of teams. Thanks for being here. HomeTeamGameDev.com, I guess, is the easiest way. Home Team Game Dev is my main service, my main work. That's my shirt I have on. There it is. That.com. People get confused and say hometown dev or whatever. It's home team, like home team in a sport, game dev. No doubt. Bye, everybody. Thanks.